I would like you to put your hands together for one of my favorite humans on the planet, Navi.
Wow, all this clapping and you haven't even heard me talk yet. How's everyone doing? All right, that was a moderate B-. How is everybody doing? Wonderful. Y'all are welcome to talk during my part, but know that I am louder than you. All right, before we get started, who am I? I direct your attention over here to this screen. I am the creator of this Star Trek synthesizer meme. That is the most successful I am as a musician and as someone who understands music history. Was this meme going viral very briefly because for some reason there is an overlap between synthesizer fans and Star Trek fans. Who would have fucking thought? So I'm going to be real with you. As Ray knows, I wrote out a whole thing, and I'm going to keep it on script, because if I go off script and just freeball it with y'all, I'll be here for like 40 minutes. So we're going to keep it tight. We're going to keep it polite. I'm going to go through a couple of caveats before we begin. Like I said before, the following presentation is an extremely condensed overview of its subject matter. Extremely! Furthermore, the presenter does not claim to be the ultimate authority on the subject presented, just an avid fan with a love for the subject matter. Cool, I get it. You may know more of the little eccentric synth people, maybe. I encourage you to talk about it with me after, because I cut like 30 pages from this. Cool? All right, one final thing about intersectionality before we get started, all right? And here's where I start reading off the script, because I don't want to fuck this up. Before we begin, I would like to say, this exploration of music history centers the lives of white middle to upper class individuals. It is important to note that in the early days of electronic music, it was very expensive and largely reserved for academics and people with generational wealth. I say this not to downplay these individuals and their achievements, but just to note that BIPOC pioneers in early synth history are hard to find because of inaccessibility. By the end of the timeline we're going to discuss, which is 1969, that will have changed dramatically. Cool? Are we ready? Great. You can clap. Please clap. What is a synthesizer? Anyone? Simply put, a synthesizer is any electronic device that generates audio signal. When we talk about an acoustic guitar, for the most part, you're all picturing the same instrument. I encourage you to think of a synth as an abstract concept, a guiding philosophy behind a spectrum of instruments and tools and science experiments containing an infinite possibility of sounds and noises, only limited by our imagination. So, when we talk about the history of synths, we are not talking about one specific machine, but rather an evolution of instrumentation through electronic synthesis. So where do we begin? Let's start with Ada Lovelace, the first creative hacker. In the mid-19th century, Ada worked with Charles Babbage on his theoretical machine, the analytical engine, and wrote extensive notes about its potential uses beyond standard calculation. Her philosophy of poetical science, a blend of science, imagination, and poetry, helped her theorize the potential collaborative relationship between individuals and technology. In 1843, she wrote, "Supposing that the fundamental relations of pitched sounds in the science of harmony were susceptible of such expressions and adaptations, the engine might compose elaborate and scientific music of any degree of complexity or extent. Did I rip that up too early? Yes, I did. At the dawn of the 20th century, composers were moving away from more traditional forms of music and into abstract avant-garde compositions. Composers like Debussy were crafting intricate, abstract interpretations of harmony and tone. You're currently listening to Debussy's Prelude to an Afternoon of a Faun, which is considered a tone poem, a symphonic movement evoking the abstract sensations of poetry. This music, in its day, was considered wildly experimental. It is seen as the birth of modernism in music, which has been described as the dissolution of the traditional tonality and the transformation of the very foundations of tonal language, searching for new models in altered tonality. The radical tenets of modernism would guide the next generation of composers, theorists, futurists, and radical artists, and eventually get us to the synthesizer. One of these futurists was painter Luigi Russolo. Luigi built his own instruments and called them intona rumori. What you're hearing right now is an intona rumori. In 1913, Luigi wrote a futurist manifesto entitled The Art of Noises. In it, Luigi saw a coming revolution in music, the birth of noise sound, a type of soundscape steeped in the machinery of the urbanized world, used to produce complex sonic emotions through fantastic association. His manifesto concluded, "We invite all the truly gifted and bold young musicians to analyze all noises. Our expanded sensibility will gain futurist ears, as it already has futurist eyes." A few people embody the early intersection of machinery and music better than Leon Theremin. After World War I, as an engineer for the Soviet government, he worked on radios and electronic motion sensors. Here, he developed the etherphone, a device that generated an audio signal based on the proximity of the user's hands to two antennae. We now know this device as the theremin. What we are listening to right now is a performance of The Swan by Clara Rockmore, a contemporary and close friend of theremin's and one of the earliest virtuoso synthesizer performers. She helped Leon develop and refine the theremin from a piece of technology into an emotional and evocative musical instrument. Later in life, Leon said of it, "The orchestra plays mechanically, using mechanical energy. The conductor just moves their hands, and their movements have an effect on the music artistry." In those early days, the theremin was paired with traditional orchestration and composition, perhaps as a means to soften the impact of such a strange and alien sound. But not everyone felt that way. John Cage is a fascinating presence in the development of the synthesizer. He pushed the boundaries of what modernism in music could be. From here on out, everyone we will talk about will have worked with John Cage at some point in their lives. His influence is just that omnipresent. So, who is John Cage? He was a writer and a painter who made his way into music in the 1930s. Throughout his lengthy career, he would experiment with avant-garde styles of composing and writing, incorporating chaos theory, randomness, and Zen Buddhism into his music. He obsessed over ways to break away from traditional presentation of harmony. It may not come as a surprise then to learn that John Cage was unhappy in his marriage. He got a divorce and spent the rest of his life living openly and happily gay. A traditional presentation of harmony was never in the cards for him. Let's check in on him in 1936 as he's developing the idea for a prepared piano. Like something out of Russolo's Art of Noises, which Cage was a fan of, the prepared piano is a piano that has been manipulated and altered by the addition of bolts, screws, spoons, erasers, and more to create a multi-textured, unconventional instrument. We're listening to one of his sonatas composed for a prepared piano right now. As Cage said later in life, with just one musician, you can really do an unlimited number of things if you have at your disposal an exploded keyboard. In 1965, two of Cage's contemporaries, Beebe and Louis Barron, would make history. They were classically trained musicians, inventors, and technicians who used magnetic tape and homemade electronic circuits to create and record avant-garde music in their New York house. It was here they began to work on film scoring, and the Barrons had been invited to score an upcoming film, Forbidden Planet. Forbidden Planet is known for many firsts. It had Robbie the Robot, one of the first intelligent robots on film. It was the first film to depict faster than light travel, and it had the first entirely electronic score. Because the married couple were technicians who built all of the electronics they used on the score, the American Federation of Musicians, can I get a boo for the American Federation of Musicians? Boo! The American fucking Federation of Musicians forced the studio to change their credit on the film from electronic music to electronic tonalities. Because of this, yeah, boo! Because of this, the soundtrack was ineligible for an Oscar. Exactly. In the mainstream opinion, electronic instrumentation was still seen as something alien, not human. But fans of Forbidden Planet felt otherwise. As Beebe put it, each circuit conveys strong emotional meaning to listeners. We were delighted to hear people tell us that the tonalities reminded them of what their dreams sounded like. Let's talk about institutions and nerds. Because computers at this time were expensive as shit. Millions of dollars expensive. So a good amount of development in the field of electronic synthesizers happened at academic institutions. At the Computer Music Center at Columbia University, you had people like Milton Babbitt, who in 1958 dared composers to withdraw from the public world to one of private performance and electronic media, predicting SoundCloud rap by 70 years. And at Bell Labs, a hotbed of advancement in technologies, while his colleagues were working on something called a laser. Right? Max Matthews was teaching a computer how to sing.
Daisy, Daisy, get me your answer. I'm crazy, all for the love of you.
Arthur C. Clarke was visiting Bell Labs at the time of this, and he immediately called Stanley Kubrick and said, "We have to use this in 2001: A Space Odyssey." Stanley Kubrick's gonna come back too, so don't you worry, all you Kubrick heads. Kubrickites? In 1963, Matthews published The Digital Computer as a Musical Instrument, where he laid the groundwork for how a computer could be used to make music. In response to the critics of the burgeoning genre, he said, "The best way to form an opinion about computer music is to listen to some." And it wouldn't be long before everyone would have to listen. Oh yeah. At the age of 14, Robert Moog built his own theremin. By the time he was in college, he was making and selling mail-order theremin kits. In 1964, while at Cornell, he created the first commercially sold synthesizer. It cost just under $100,000 by today's money. Moog wasn't a musician. He thought of himself as a toolmaker, and he was a very good toolmaker. He was an engineer who deeply and passionately loved sound. What the fuck are you gonna do? This is the fun part, though. Take this story. In 1965, Moog was going to school to defend his dissertation because his wife said at least a PhD will keep money on the table. Around lunchtime, they realized that Moog was nowhere to be found. You'll find that I also sweat a ton, so just get used to it. Moog was nowhere to be found. He hadn't shown up. It turns out that on his way up to his defense, Moog became so fascinated by the sound the elevator made. He kept riding it between floors, jumping up and down to try and find the resonant frequency. But somewhere between the 4th and the 5th floor, the elevator broke. It took them 4 hours to find him. Bob Moog is one of the people most responsible for making synthesizers accessible. He loved nothing more than to tweak and adjust his machines based on the needs of a musician. And while traditional music establishments still saw synthesizers as alien, cold, and inhuman, Moog knew the synthesizer was destined to become an important instrument for a musician, not their competitor. As he said, "I was never worried that synthesizers would replace musicians. First of all, you have to be a musician in order to make music with a synthesizer. But it would be a colleague of his who would finally take the synthesizer mainstream." From a young age, Wendy Carlos was the perfect storm of musical and technological genius. She composed her first piece of music at the age of 10, and she won a scholarship for building a computer at the age of 14. She graduated from Brown in 1962 with a degree in music and physics, while teaching informal lessons in electronic music and theremin. She spent time at Bell Labs and the Computer Music Center. She worked with Leonard Bernstein and John Cage. And in 1965, at the annual Audio Engineering Convention, she met Bob Moog. Her relationship with Moog would redefine the synthesizer. She suggested tweaks like touch sensitivity, touch sensitivity, that would allow a performer to explore nuance and emotion in their performance. She was at the forefront of exploring expressions of humanity through electronic musical synthesis. And Wendy Carlos is also an icon in transgender history. Assigned male at birth, Wendy suffered from gender dysphoria throughout her entire childhood. In her 30s, she had begun counseling and radical hormone treatment. Although she would not come out publicly until 1979 in a fucking fascinating interview with Playboy magazine, Wendy was anxious to liberate herself. And then, in 1968, Wendy released Switched on Bach. Switched on Bach is Bach performed entirely on moog modular synthesizers. Wendy wanted to bring accessible synthesizer music to the masses, and like Leon Theremin before her, she used classical music to do so. Switched on Bach was a massive, groundbreaking commercial success. It topped the Billboard Classic charts for 3 years. It cracked the top 200 overall. It won 3 Grammys. It sold millions of units. It was the second classical album to be certified platinum. And in 2005, it was inducted into the National Recording Registry at the Library of Congress. It introduced countless young musicians to the synthesizer and influenced almost all of the popular music that would come in its wake. Wendy used the commercial success of Switched on Bach to pay for gender confirmation surgery. When asked in the Playboy interview if her music and her gender identity were connected, she said, "Switched on Bach stimulated strong reactions. Those who were comfortable in all forms of music, those who were open to novel variations, loved it. Being transgender tends to polarize people too, depending on the attitude one brings to sexuality and human rights. In both cases, there is no middle ground." It's no surprise that Wendy Carlos was so enthralled by another polarizing piece of art, Anthony Burgess's Clockwork Orange, that she petitioned Stanley Kubrick to let her score the film. A Clockwork Orange, from the Cockney phrase, queer as a clockwork orange, is something seemingly normal, organic on the surface, but utterly bizarre and mechanical internally. And indeed, what is the voice of the synthesizer, if not a clockwork orange? By the early 70s, the synth had gone mainstream. Artists of all genres were incorporating it into their songs. Jazz, rock and roll, the Beach Boys, disco was born, Stevie Wonder was using it, funk. And it continued to become more accessible. Adjusted, a mini moog in the mid-70s would cost just under $9,000. Today you can buy an entry-level synth for around $400 to $500. Most musicians you know have a synthesizer somewhere in their lineup. I think of the synthesizer as the first instrument of modern music, born from the industrial and the information revolutions, defying norms and expectations, encouraging exploration and unconventional thinking. The synthesizer has always been fucking nerdy, and it's always been fucking queer. It has proved that a musical voice can express itself however it wants to sound. And this is the story, but not the only story, about how radical identities shape the fucking synthesizer. Thank you.